Welcome to Reframing Me. I'm your host, Dr. Jennifer Brubaker. In this special 6-part series, Reframing the Conversation, we're exploring one of the most complex issues that families face today: communicating across political divides. In a world that's increasingly polarized, these divides can take a toll on our relationships. But with the right knowledge and strategies, we can reconnect. In this series, we'll explore the psychology of political polarization, we'll address how we have gotten to this point, and we'll find strategies for how we can have healthier conversations. Together, we'll reframe the way that we approach these challenging discussions and complicated relationships, focusing on empathy, active listening, and finding common ground. So get ready to shift your perspective and reframe the way that you handle family and political discourse. Hey guys, it's Jen. This is another episode of Reframing Me. This is the 4th part of Reframing the Conversation, a special 6-part series of Reframing Me focused on repairing and protecting family relationships despite political dissension in our very polarized political climate. We aim to do this through effective and civil communication. No, up until now, this hasn't been our typical family communication conversation. But now this part has us getting back on track. Now that we have an understanding of why we are aiming for civil political communication within our families, and we have a good understanding of how we got to this point because of both external factors like the media and internal factors like how we establish our political opinions, now we can talk about how we can be a good communicator of those opinions. This is the civil discourse part, and civil discourse is such an important life skill to have. Healthy and effective communication of potentially uncomfortable or controversial topics is truly something that we are all, collectively as a society, we are all better off when people can communicate well, whether we're talking politics or pretty much anything, right? If you haven't already listened, make sure you go back and listen to part 1 about why it is so critical for us to reframe the conversation, and listen to part 2 about how we got to this point, and part 3 where we discussed political socialization and media literacy. So our conversation for today is essentially how to be a good communicator of political opinions, how to create healthy and effective civil discourse. And this will apply in your families, in your friendships, and just basically in society. Because in a democratic society, the ability to communicate political opinions effectively is essential, just like in general. But it's essential for participating in public life and contributing to political debates and fostering civil discourse. And more specifically, it is absolutely essential in our own interpersonal relationships. But I think we all know that discussing political topics can become very challenging when we are in environments that are full of polarization and emotions and misinformation. Our society in general right now could absolutely be characterized as full of polarization, emotions, and misinformation, right? And unfortunately, so very many of our families have been impacted by this same division. Relationships have been damaged, families have been split, holidays have been ruined, all because of these divisions and the inability to have healthy discourse. Because we all know that talking politics at the dinner table or during family gatherings, it can quickly turn into heated arguments. But it doesn't need to be that way. So the goal of today's episode is to unpack how to understand the underlying motivations behind your family members' political beliefs and how you can engage in healthy, constructive discourse without damaging your family relationships. If I had to summarize in one quick point, one takeaway, to have healthy discourse, especially when maintaining the relationship is important to you, focus on understanding, not on winning. There are many scenarios in our lives where our purpose or our goal is to persuade, and that's great. Absolutely. What we should be doing is sticking to our beliefs and aiming for persuasion. But in our families, when we are having similar discourse about controversial topics, about politics, we do need to prioritize which is more important to us in that scenario, persuasion or the relationship. Sometimes you will be able to actually have both. Taking the relationship approach may ultimately lead to persuasion. But in other situations, if you stick to the persuasion approach, you will damage the relationship, possibly irreparably. But regardless, whether you are aiming for persuasion or not, if we want to create healthy and effective civil discourse, we need to develop strong communication skills, engage respectfully with others, and approach political discussions with a focus on understanding rather than winning. We have spent the last 3 episodes talking about our increasingly polarized political landscape. And we all see that civil discourse has become a very rare commodity. What are our choices? We can avoid political conversations altogether for fear of conflict, or we can just jump right into those debates that really only deepen the divisions. And so we know that navigating these conversations is more critical now than ever. For so many people, political views have become their personal identities, and our relationships are totally impacted knowing this. I truly believe that in a healthy democracy, political discourse should promote understanding and collaboration and solutions. And today, we are not seeing that at all. Many political conversations devolve into shouting matches. And for some, it's the silence that really speaks volumes. Either way, we're feeling alienated from each other, and it makes it nearly impossible to maintain some healthy relationships. But it's not hopeless, I promise. There is a way to engage in political conversations that maybe can build some bridges rather than burn them, extend some olive branches. And so our conversation today is going to center around being someone who can approach difficult and controversial conversations with empathy, open-mindedness, and effectiveness. We can use specific communication strategies to make our political conversations create understanding and make connections, and maybe, just maybe, even preserve respect for each other, even when our disagreements run deep. Our primary goal cannot be to win debates or to change minds. Instead, our goal needs to be to engage in meaningful and respectful dialogue. But to do this, there are some important attributes that we need to dig out, and we need to understand the psychology that's behind our differing political perspectives. And once we're set there, we need to communicate well. So we're going to talk about how to do that by matching someone's conversational mindset. And I'll go over some practical strategies for civil political discourse. My goal is to give you the tools that you need to effectively communicate your political views while maintaining healthy relationships in your families, even with those who disagree with you. Okay, so I read this amazing book recently called Super Communicators, and I think that that is a perfect concept to apply here. A super communicator is someone who excels in any conversations, but especially in those that are difficult or controversial. So yes, political conversations would totally qualify. Now, what sets a super communicator apart is their ability to focus not on winning, but on fostering a connection with the person and creating a mutual understanding with them. So these people are the kind who create a safe space for dialogue. So like a place where both people can express their opinions without a fear of judgment or confrontation. So they have the emotional intelligence and the empathy and the active listening skills to engage with other people in really meaningful conversations. So not just like shallow surface level stuff. And this allows for more productive exchanges that don't harm the relationships. And to do this, to be this way, it's super important to understand that our political beliefs are often deeply tied to our personal identity. So rather than attacking or invalidating the other person's views, which will make them feel like you are attacking or invalidating their personal identity, but rather than doing that, it's much better to engage with them with empathy, asking questions, listening carefully. We need to manage our own emotions so that we can ensure that even in the middle, even in the heat of a contentious debate, we need to be able to remain calm and respectful and remain focused on the shared goals of our conversation. And this emotional regulation, it then allows us to guide the conversations towards constructive outcomes, even if the topic itself is deeply divisive. And so, because of this, all right, there are 5 key characteristics of super communicators. First is one that we have talked about many times: active listening. Active listening, because just like we've said with our teens, the foundation of any meaningful conversation is listening. We need to listen to understand, not just listen to respond and prepare a counter argument. When we listen to understand, we are giving our full attention to the person that we are talking with, which makes them feel heard and makes them feel validated. If we instead are only looking to respond, we're thinking about ourselves. We're thinking about the topic itself. And what we're not doing is giving the person in front of us our attention. Second, something that is so important and a key element lacking in so many political discussions, and honestly, discussions and issues in general: empathy. As a collective, we really struggle to look at things from others' perspectives. We judge so quickly based on our own experiences. But by putting ourselves in the other person's shoes, like in someone else's space, to see it from their perspective, then we can recognize the emotions and the experiences that shaped their political beliefs. And if we can do that, we can respond with compassion and without judgment. So, just to take it out of politics for a minute, there's a mom at football, and she's a lot, like screaming and yelling. Okay, fairly normal, but she's also a bit mean about it and directed at our boys. Even she's gone to posting things in the sports app about kids in positions not doing their jobs. Feels way harsh. I just have a really hard time personally attacking a teenager, like verbally assaulting them basically to their parents. Now, you may be thinking, that's awful, right? I used to think that too. But her son is a running back. And I used to think that she was criticizing the offensive line because she wanted him to get more yards. And she probably partially was. But then one day she yelled something about protecting him, and it made me see it from her perspective. He could get really hurt. He's super dependent on those boys to do their position's job to protect her son. No, he won't be able to get the superstar yards he needs if they don't block. But he could also have a terrible injury if they don't block. If that was my son, and it was, when my oldest was playing football, he was the punter, and he totally relied on his shield to keep him safe on the field. So I get it. But I didn't see it from her perspective. We do this with political issues all of the time. We believe things and we fight for positions that deal with issues that we've never had to face. We have beliefs about people fleeing from countries with unstable governments to give their children a safe life when we have never been in a situation even close to that. Have you ever had the empathy to look at it and to think, what if that was me? How must that person feel? Or it's a lot easier to understand people who are different than you when you live in a diverse area and you find yourself in environments that are filled with diversity of backgrounds and ethnicities and races and perspectives, all kinds of people. But have you given much thought to what it must be like when you aren't exposed to different people or different cultures or different religions, when everyone around you looks and sounds and feels like you? It must be unsettling to see things that are very unfamiliar. It might even drive you to make judgments based on the information that you do have, most of all, which comes from the media, not from their own experiences. If you haven't thought of any of this, you should. Empathy makes the world a much grayer, but much better place. And third, patience. Oh, such a tough one, right? When you feel passionately about something, you want it to change now. You want them to stop and look at you and say, "You are so right. You made me change my mind. You made me see the error of my ways." Trust me, I get it. I have relationships in my own life that it has taken a long time for them to come around. Changing deeply held beliefs, it takes time, if it even happens at all. And so we need to understand that conversations are a part of a longer process of dialogue and mutual understanding. We can't strong arm people into believing what we want them to. We can't rush to impose our views on them. It's hard, but we need to allow the conversation to develop naturally over time. Fourth, another tough one. But I guess if it was easy, everyone would be a super communicator, right? Non-defensiveness. We need to remain open-minded and non-defensive when we are confronted with those opposing viewpoints. I know, right? We've just said that we need to understand that their political beliefs are tied to their identities. Well, guess what? So are ours, right? And so that makes it awfully hard for us not to be defensive. But instead of viewing this disagreement as being a threat, we need to reframe it and we need to see it as being an opportunity for growth and understanding. And fifth, I like this one a lot. I would have to say that this is one that I probably don't always consider. We need to focus on our shared values. When we face someone who has different beliefs about something than we do, it's really challenging to find those commonalities, right? Because all we see are the glaring differences. But so often, really, most times, if we're honest, we all have common goals. Like we all want happiness and health and prosperity and safety. We all get defensive when we feel threatened. We all feel some degree of uncertainty or fear when we are in situations with people we don't understand. Where we differ, though, is in how we approach it, how we manage these feelings, what we believe is the way to reach the goal of solving the problem or managing the issue. So we need to seek common ground, find and emphasize those shared goals or values rather than only focusing on the difference. Freedom, safety and security, respect for human life. Chances are, when I said each one of those things, each one of you thought of a political position that corresponds to it, right? Respect for human life. You may have thought, yes, and that is why I am pro-life, to prevent women from having abortions and for taking the life of an unborn child. Or maybe you thought, yes, and that's why I'm pro-choice, to prevent women from dying due to complications from a pregnancy when termination is no longer available to them. Same issue, same underlying shared value, or freedom. You might think, yes, and that's why I have a right to own guns, to protect myself and feel secure and feel safe, and that's why I'm pro-gun. Or maybe you thought, yes, and that's why I want stricter gun laws, so that my children can be safe and secure at school, and I can feel safe and secure sending them to school. We all have the shared belief of freedom and of security. The problem is we do really only organically see our way as the way. It's really hard to be like, oh, that's a valid position when you're thinking, oh my God, are you serious? How do you even see that as being the same? Or being okay. And yet the reality is that if we can do this, that's how we can actually collaborate and reduce our polarization. Now, before I go on, I'm just wondering if I've made you uncomfortable with any of this. I'm guessing I have. I'll be honest, I make myself uncomfortable with it too. It's so much more comfortable to believe that your view is, quote, the right way. It's really uncomfortable to even imagine that you could be wrong, that maybe the world isn't as black and white as we thought. That's the cognitive dissonance that we talked about in the previous episode. When our attitudes and our behaviors are out of alignment, we feel icky inside. The example I always give is if you believe in eating healthy, if it's part of who you are, and you're eating an apple, awesome, you feel great, in alignment, all is well, consonance. But if you believe in eating healthy and you're eating a donut, you're thrown off, right? Your behavior doesn't line up with your attitude about eating healthy. So we want to get rid of that icky feeling. That icky feeling is actually called dissonance. And so we start doing the mental gymnastics to justify it. Well, we deserve a treat, or we worked out extra hard today. We'll eat super healthy for dinner, blah, blah, blah. It's okay to eat the donut sometimes, even though we feel off because of it. It's okay to see the world from a different perspective, but it does make us feel icky, which is why most people don't like to do it. And that's really one of the most significant reasons that political conversations become so heated. Our political beliefs are so deeply intertwined with our identity. We define ourselves, like who we are as a person, by our personal values and by the groups we belong to, being a mom, a working mom, a sports mom. And this definitely extends to political parties and social movements and cultural communities. And so political conversations can feel very personal, even when they are about abstract policy issues. And challenging someone's political beliefs can totally feel like an attack on their sense of self. Ego involvement is a theory that does help to explain why political beliefs are so hard to change. It basically says that when a person's identity and their self-esteem are closely tied to their political beliefs, any challenges to those beliefs can feel like a direct threat to their self-worth. And the more ego involvement that a person has in their political views, the more resistant they are to opposing perspectives. So this explains why political discussions often escalate into more emotional conflicts. If someone feels that their identity is under attack, they are much more likely to become defensive or to act hostile. And so it's important for us to recognize the emotional stakes that are at play in our political conversations. So instead of attacking the other person's beliefs, which of course we know can and will trigger defensiveness, instead of those attacks, we need to try to understand the personal and the emotional reasons that are behind those beliefs. And if we can do this, it helps to diffuse the tension and it can open the door for more meaningful and compassionate dialogue. Now, similarly, we all have things called cognitive biases, and these are unconscious ways of thinking that affect how we actually process information. We've already talked about one of these, but in political communication, two of the most common biases are confirmation bias and motivated reasoning. Remember, we said that confirmation bias is our tendency to seek out and interpret information in a way that confirms our beliefs, find information that supports and confirms what we already believe to be true, and basically to avoid that icky feeling, right? And also, when we hear or see something, we interpret it in a way to, again, confirm our beliefs, again, to avoid that icky feeling. Now, motivated reasoning is very similar because it's our inclination to interpret evidence to support our identities or our ideas. A good example of this is climate change. People who deny or discredit scientific information about climate shifts in order to fit their beliefs. Why? Well, if they accept climate change, we would need to adjust our lives and our behaviors in a way that they don't want to. Maybe they drive a fuel inefficient vehicle, or they are bothered by recycling. It would be uncomfortable to change, and so it's easier to deny the evidence. We saw a lot of this during COVID. Many people hated wearing masks. I mean, we all hated it, obviously. It sucked. But masks and vaccines and testing, all things that were scientifically proven, but accepting the evidence would make them also need to accept behaviors or accept a lifestyle that they didn't want. So what do? deny the scientific evidence. Sometimes it's just easier. But health communications sees this a lot. Doctors who can't get people to come in for the exams or follow through on the treatments that they need. I mean, how many of us stop those 10-day antibiotics after like 7 days? I am guilty. The doctor, the literal expert, the one who has absolutely nothing to gain or lose if you do or don't do this. That doctor is telling you that the evidence says to take the full course or go in for the exam or schedule the appointment. And yet we don't, like as a collective. And it frustrates doctors to no end. Why? Why do we dismiss evidence? Y'all, it makes us uncomfortable. It makes us consider our mortality. What if they find something? It makes us feel like we know best. So yeah, these biases also make it very difficult for people to accept information that contradicts their political beliefs. Even when presented with facts, we are much more likely to dismiss or downplay the information that challenges our worldview. And of course, this is especially true when our political beliefs are tied to our identity. This is why it's important for us to be aware of these biases, not only in others, but also in ourselves. We need to recognize that people's resistance to new information or to change is not necessarily due to their ignorance or to their stubbornness, but is often just due to the psychological need to protect themselves or protect their identity. And if we can understand this about people we care about who do have those conflicting political views, we can approach these political conversations with more empathy and with more patience. And then understanding where they're coming from becomes the immediate goal, not changing their mind. We're playing the long game here. Okay, Jen, I get it. So how do we do this? Well, obviously, some people may just organically have these personality traits, but anyone can develop the skills to communicate better. The first step, as it is with so many things, is self-awareness. So reflect on how your own beliefs and your own biases and your own emotions, how did they influence your personal communication style? What triggers you emotionally during political conversations? Because by understanding your own reactions, you can better control them and maintain a calm, constructive approach when you're having the difficult conversations. And second is active listening. Develop the skill of listening to understand. Just try it in any conversation. Whoever you're talking to next, whether it's about politics or with your son about school or your daughter about practice, maybe it's only about the latest tea at school or the video game they're obsessed with, but focus entirely on what they are saying. Avoid interrupting and don't try to prepare your response while they're talking. I do this 100%. I know I do this. I think it's my anxiety, like when I need to introduce myself in a meeting and I honestly don't hear anyone in front of me's introduction because I'm busy preparing in my head what I'm going to say. So instead, ask questions to clarify what they're saying and paraphrase their points to make sure that you fully understand their perspective before responding. Third, develop that empathy. I know it's uncomfortable because we all like to think that we are empathetic. But are you actually? Empathy allows us to understand the emotional and the experiential roots of their political beliefs. It's so easy to judge people for their political opinions. But by putting yourself in their shoes, you can respond with compassion instead of judgment. Ask yourself, what personal experiences or fears might be driving their beliefs, and then respond with understanding. And fourth, manage your emotional triggers. Political conversations can be totally emotionally charged. So be able to recognize when you're becoming emotionally triggered and take steps to calm yourself. Practice the pause, remember? And fifth, focus on the relationship. Keep the priority on the relationship. Make it more important than winning an argument. This helps to create an environment where everyone feels safe to express their views openly and honestly. This might be harder to do in random conversations or relationships, but when it's with your family, this should be a lot easier to manage. Okay, so switching gears just a tiny bit. One of the points that the author makes in Super Communicators is that one of the key skills of communication is the ability to match the conversation to the mindset of the person you are speaking with. So, like when you want to complain about work and your partner starts giving you all of the feedback to fix the problems, and all it does is make you angrier, right? Because you're not looking for an answer, you just want to complain. Tell me, I totally should be annoyed and frustrated and leave it at that, okay? So instead, now you're mad at work and at home. Awesome. He was just trying to help, just trying to solve your problem. But that's not the conversation that you wanted to have. Along the same lines, different types of conversation require different types of approaches. And understanding the nature of the conversation is super important to navigating it effectively. And in political conversations, it is particularly important to distinguish between three types of conversations: decision-making conversations, emotional conversations, and social conversations. Decision-making conversations are focused on finding solutions or reaching conclusions based on logic and evidence and reason. These conversations are goal-oriented, and they typically involve an exchange of facts or data or arguments in order to come to a decision. Now, emotional conversations are driven by feelings, not by facts. So these conversations often come up when someone is expressing frustration or fear or anger about a political issue. And in these cases, the goal is not to reach a decision or not to solve a problem, but instead to validate the other person's emotions. And the third type is social conversations. Those are casual and just relationship building exchanges that may touch on political topics lightly, but they are not focused on anything like solving problems or resolving differences. These conversations are only meant to strengthen or to maintain the personal connection, not to debate politics. So the key is to have the same conversation, or rather the same type of conversation with the other person that they are having with you, because then you can use applicable communication strategies in your conversation. Otherwise, you're the partner who is presenting evidence to someone who just wants your support. So a decision-making conversation might be one about candidates' tax policy, maybe talking about evidence that either policy will be effective. And if you're in a decision-making conversation, it's the time for asking clarifying questions and presenting evidence and working collaboratively to find a solution that meets everyone's needs. But if you're in an emotional conversation, the person might be expressing fear over an increase in gun violence. So to successfully communicate, you'd want to focus on empathy and validation of their feelings. And instead of offering solutions or counter arguments like you would do in a decision-making conversation, you are best to listen to them without interrupting and to acknowledge the person's emotions and provide them with your support. And then in social conversations, it's important to keep things light and avoid getting into any contentious issues. So basically steer the conversation away from topics that could lead to conflict. Like at a holiday and someone mentions a political issue, rather than engaging in a debate, maybe just go with, "That's interesting. I'd love to hear more about your thoughts on that later." Something that is very helpful to understand is that many political conversations actually involve both a surface topic and an underlying topic. So the surface topic is the issue that's being discussed. Okay, makes sense. But then there's an underlying topic, which is super important and helpful to understand if you want to have a really meaningful dialogue. Because the underlying topic is the deeper concern that the person is dealing with. So, like a discussion about gun control may seem like it's about policy, but the underlying concern is actually about safety, or their fear of crime, or a desire for their personal empowerment, or like a debate about immigration might actually reflect their real concerns, which are about cultural change or economic security or losing their job. And if you are able to identify the underlying topics and address them directly, you can engage in a more meaningful conversation because you are addressing the real issues at hand. This approach creates a deeper understanding and it reduces the likelihood that the conversation will become combative. So, based off of everything that we've talked about, I think that we can summarize with a list of communication strategies. So, let's finish up by going over 10 rules for healthy and constructive political communication in your families. Number 1, be an active listener. Listen to understand, not to respond. This means giving your full attention to the person speaking without planning your rebuttal while they talk. You will make the other person feel heard and validated, and you'll reduce their defensiveness in the conversation. Number 2, show empathy and compassion. Put yourself in the other person's shoes to understand the emotions and the experiences that are at the roots of their beliefs. Respond to them with compassion rather than judgment. Remember, our political beliefs are often tied to our personal identity and to our emotions. Number 3, don't be defensive. Approach political disagreements without viewing them as personal attacks. Remain calm, open-minded, non-defensive, even when you're confronted with opposing viewpoints. Do this to keep the conversation productive, and it will prevent it from escalating into an argument. Number 4, be patient. You need to understand that deeply held political beliefs are not likely to change overnight. So be patient and recognize that conversations are part of a longer process of mutual understanding. Forcing someone to agree with you immediately will just cause further tension and damage the relationship. It's a marathon, y'all, not a sprint. Number 5, focus on the relationship, not on winning. Prioritize your family relationship over the desire to win a political debate. If maintaining the relationship is more important to you than persuading the other person, then consider setting aside your goal of changing their mind. In some cases, focusing on understanding rather than persuasion may even lead to eventual shifts in perspective. Number 6, match the conversation to the mindset. Understand the type of conversation that you are having and match your communication strategy accordingly. Some conversations are decision-making, some are emotional, and others are social. So just make sure that you adjust your approach to match the type of conversation that the other person is having to be more effective. Number 7, try to differentiate and address the underlying topic. Recognize that beneath the surface of political debates, there are often much deeper concerns. So focus on these underlying concerns to make the conversation more meaningful and less combative. By addressing these issues, you'll help get to the root of the disagreement. Number 8, set boundaries. It is important for us to set boundaries when necessary. So like if a political discussion becomes too heated or too personal, be willing to pause the conversation or steer it in a different direction if it threatens the relationship. Number 9, collaborate and find common ground. Try to find some areas of agreement, even when your political views differ. Most people share core values such as safety and freedom and well-being, but they differ in how they think these values should be achieved. But if you can highlight these shared goals, you can shift the conversation from conflict to collaboration. And number 10, allow yourself to be vulnerable. Allow yourself to be open. Although it may be uncomfortable, if you are willing to share your own uncertainties, your own vulnerabilities, by admitting that you don't have all of the answers, it can foster a much more genuine dialogue because vulnerability invites others to be open and to be less defensive, which makes it easier to connect and to communicate. All right, y'all. I don't know about you, but I am exhausted. I know that it has taken a minute for us to get to the, okay, so tell me how to do this part. But I really do believe that the buildup of the episodes was just as important. So if you haven't already listened, go back and listen to the first 3 parts of this series. I think it's so interesting to realize that it's so much more than learning to talk about politics, right? It's actually about fostering healthy, meaningful conversations that creates a connection and creates that understanding. In today's polarized world, because the ability to engage in civil discourse is so much more important than ever, if we can practice that active listening and empathy and curiosity and vulnerability, if we can do this, we can create spaces where people feel safe to share their views and to engage in respectful dialogue, even when they disagree. And if we can all just start with our families, we can start to put that positivity out into the world. Political conversations don't have to be divisive or destructive. If you use the right approach, they can be opportunities for a deeper understanding and for collaboration and for positive change. So let's move beyond polarization and let's go towards a more inclusive and respectful and productive political dialogue. And this dialogue can actually strengthen our relationships and our families and our communities and our world. But wait, you may be saying, I can do that. I can totally communicate with people who have these different perspectives, but maybe your family relationship isn't that. You're saying that they are an extremist. This isn't a we disagree on tax policy kind of thing. This is a we disagree on basic human rights. Or they know it's a lie and they just don't seem to care that it's a lie. You may be thinking that you can't communicate with that, and I totally get it. We live in a very complex society, and that complex society, I know, has infiltrated many families. So come back for the next episode. In part 5, that's where we're going to talk about political extremists, how and why they got that way, and most importantly, how can you communicate with them and ideally even maintain a relationship with them. Thank you so much for listening today and always. If you've enjoyed the show, please share it with your friends, especially this series, because that's how we will always continue to grow our community. Find me on socials. It's always Reframing Me everywhere. And now it's also Reframing the Conversation on Instagram, TikTok, and Facebook. And you can check out the new website, reframingtheconversation.com, jenniferbrubaker.com, or always reframingme.com. Until next time, be well and communicate.